For those attending a Tang Center event for the first time, the TCSRS, as we call ourselves, was founded just last year to advance research and teaching on the Silk Roads at UC Berkeley. It joins the Tang Center for East Asian Art at Princeton and also the Tang Center for Early China at Columbia University as one of 3 centers endowed by the Tang Family Foundation to promote the study of ancient China. For those, again, new to the Tang Center events, we organize a year-long programmatic activities that center on a particular theme. At least it's an experiment to see if this is a useful approach. This year we decided to cover the Maritime Silk Road. So our annual colloquium series, we had a workshop and an annual lecture on the Maritime Silk Roads. And it's hoped that at the end of this year, we'll be able to put out a publication on this very specific theme. And we've already been in discussion with UC Press, and they're very interested in starting a Silk Road series, a Silk Road Studies series. The reason why we gravitated towards the maritime trading routes in our inaugural year stems from UC Berkeley's participation in a joint project co-directed by Deborah Carlson, who some of you know very well, now president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M, Osman Boperachi from the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, who is also a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, Senrad Dissanayake, who was then, when we actually were involved in this project between 2010 and 2015, the head or the deputy general of the Sri Lanka Department of Archaeology, and then the 4th co-director was myself. The Godavari Project centered on the excavation of the fragmentary remains of a 2,000-year-old shipwreck off the southern coast of Sri Lanka, named after the nearby village. And you can see it here on the map. Sorry. This ship, it turns out, was carrying, among others, a cargo of iron, copper, grinding stones, and also glass ingots of various colors. And I'm sure that James will be referencing those glass ingots in his talk on the movement of glass across Asia. Despite several seasons of exploration, there are still many unknowns about the ship. Some practical, such as the identification of the particular type of vessel, but also on a broader scale, how the vessel connected to iron and glass production sites in southern Sri Lanka, as well as the Buddhist settlement of Tissa Maharama, where similar grinding stones that the ship was carrying were discovered. Also unknown is its exact relationship to the ancient port excavated at Godavari, which unfortunately, at least on the basis of extant remains, seems to postdate the wreckage site. Where were these raw materials coming from and headed? Was the ship part of a larger maritime network, or was it moving to and from specific points of production and manufacture? Finding answers to these questions, I think, is important to shed light on the way in which mercantile communities inhabited the littoral landscape and were affected by micro-regional trends. The Godavari Project underscored the challenges of coming up with a workable maritime network analysis. Can terms like archaic globalization or, quote unquote, the maritime Silk Roads be deployed effectively to understand the Indian Ocean trading networks on a macro level? Or do we instead need to locate these networks in space and time to examine the intricacies and variables that not only influence the space between port cities, but also the composition of those cities and their relation to the hinterland, as well as patterns of consumerism? So to discuss and this is my map of all the various networks of the early Common Era. So the question then becomes, how can one integrate those effectively on a macro-regional scale or not? Or do we really have to zero in on the nitty-gritty of these more localized networks? To discuss some of these issues, we have brought together, I think, a wonderful group of scholars and asked them to highlight recent research on some of these networks that operated across and around the Indian Ocean. We also asked them to focus on the spatial configurations specific to maritime trade and or the transformations of cultural and material artifacts as a result of those exchanges. I'm going to stop here because I really am not listed as giving a talk, so I've said enough, but it does give me great pleasure to introduce the chair of the first panel, Professor Osman Boperachi, who for the past several years has become very well known to our faculty as a visiting professor, our faculty and students. He's a very popular instructor on this campus. Most of you are very familiar with his impressive resume, so I just wanted to mention that following his retirement as Director of Research at the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, and visiting professor at the University of Sorbonne, he signed up to come to Berkeley as an adjunct professor of Central and South Asian art and archaeology and numismatics. So please help me welcome Osman Boperachi.
I'll be presenting the three speakers today. First of all, Eivind Heldaas, Seland. He's professor of ancient history and pre-modern global history, Department of Archaeology, History, Cultural Studies and Religion, University of Bergen in Norway. Most of Professor Seland's research addresses how economy, political power, and ideology, religion interacted in early states, complex societies in the ancient world. His publications and research oriented towards the Indian Ocean and Red Sea region, connected with the Near East and also Mediterranean and Central Asia. Currently, he is investigating how the physical environment influenced travel and communication along both sea and land routes. He also studies how historians, archaeologists, and paleoclimatologists have cast climate as an agent of historical change in order to identify good models of climate-society interrelation. He has just finished a 4-year project funded by the Research Council of Norway on mechanism of cross-cultural interaction networks in the Roman Near East. The project investigated networks of commercial, religious, and political nature within and across fluctuating imperial borders in the Near East in the Roman period. Among his many publications, I will only cite 2 books. One was published in 2016, Ships of the Desert and Ships of the Sea, Palmyra in the World Trade of the First 3 Centuries. And his recent book, published in 2017, I love the title, Sinews of Empire, Networks in the Roman Near East and Beyond. I'm an admirer of his research and also his approach to the question we are dealing with today, as Sanjot well explained. So his today's talk, Space, Places and Things, Spatiality in Early Indian Ocean Exchange, will certainly be an excellent introduction to the theme of our conference, Across the High Seas, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Indian Ocean. Eivind, please.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank you, Osman, for that very flattering, slightly intimidating introduction. I have a lot to live up to now. Can you hear me when I'm talking like this? Good. Well, in 1595, the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius published his Par Ergon, a historical atlas of the ancient world, which was intended to supplement his world atlas called the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theater of the spherical earth. One of the maps covered the Indian Ocean in the ancient period, and it was based primarily on the Greek 1st century text known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which had been translated into Italian and printed by the Venetian scholar Giovan Battista Ramusio 45 years earlier. But the map also included information from other ancient texts. Ortelius' map is not only visually appealing, with a lot of nice details, like these sea snakes here, just off the coast of western India. Mind you, not as mythical sea monsters, but mentioned as a sign that you are now approaching the coast. But the map is also broadly consistent with our modern historical maps of the Indian Ocean, even if it is, admittedly, in some places, hundreds of kilometers off target. It doesn't matter so much on this scale, because its purpose is to visualize a text, not to navigate or to visit places on the ground. What Ortelius was really doing here was fixing a textual narrative in a visual representation of geographical space. And in doing this, he combined and reconciled the geographical knowledge of his days, the 16th century, accumulated over a century of European trade and exploration in the Indian Ocean, with the rediscovered knowledge of ancient times, and thus not only creating a connection between a prestigious past and European activities in the Indian Ocean in his present, but also casting the Indian Ocean region as a remote, exotic, partly dangerous, and not yet very well known region. This might have made sense from 16th century Antwerp, where Ortelius worked, but hardly from an Indian Ocean perspective, neither in the 1st century CE nor in the early modern period. It would not be fair to Ortelius to say that this created a problem we are struggling with until today, but his map is certainly a symptom of it, namely that we continue to tend to see the Indian Ocean as a periphery of the Mediterranean world, which of course it never was. And I cannot stress this enough, it was the center of its own world, and this is something we need to appreciate if we would like to understand what was going on. Until around 30 years ago, Ortelius' map was not that bad as a representation of our modern knowledge of trade and navigation in the Indian Ocean, as this knowledge was mainly based on literary accounts from the Roman period. But this has changed tremendously. We have new and critical editions and commentaries of these literary sources, but more importantly, there's been an explosion in the volume of available archaeological data, which allows us to fix the position of quite a few of these places, to study their settlement history and their contact with other places, by way of proxies, such as things that were produced elsewhere. Ceramics are very important in this, but also botanical material, including remains of foods, textiles, and ships, and as James will tell us later today, also glass. We also, mostly by way of epigraphy, know much more about the people who were traveling and trading, what script they used, in some instances, what place they called home. And finally, we know also a bit more about the ships that sailed the Indian Ocean from ethnographic studies and from finds made in ports, primarily in ancient Egypt, although only a bit, as due to preservation, the remarkable wreck sites that have been found, for instance, in Sri Lanka, Saudi Arabia, and Eritrea, show mainly remains of the cargo and not so much of the ships themselves. So, even if we're still getting a lot of new data every year, as I think we'll hear more about in these 2 days, I think it's fair to say that we already know quite a bit about those 3 Ps: people, places, and products that were involved in ancient Indian Ocean trade. What, however, is less clear to us is the processes by which they interacted. As scholars, we would like to move beyond description towards explanation and perhaps even understanding. That, of course, is easier said than done, but I think nevertheless that the enterprise is worthwhile. Historical geographers have long been aware that history takes place, and by that they mean that we need to take the physical environment into account when approaching the past. This realization is what was dubbed the spatial turn in the social sciences, and I include archaeology and history in the social sciences here, and this goes back at least a century. We've become pretty good at doing that in finding, excavating, and discussing quite a few ports that were active in the Indian Ocean trade, and juxtaposing them with a historical record. GIS tools increasingly allow us to understand how historical and archaeological data correlate with the physical environment. Social scientists has also become aware that if we want to understand change, we need to investigate interaction as much as the agents themselves. And that interaction does not have to imply contact between people, but just might as well also involve objects and places. This much younger development, mainly over the last 2 decades, arguably amounts to a relational turn, which, among other things, have brought network theory and network analysis to prominence, and is also what we are going to discuss here over the next 2 days. Critical geographers, however, and I'm especially inspired by the work of Edvard Soja and Doreen Massey here, warn us that if you want to appreciate the triad of history, geography, and society, we need to fully integrate them, because only then we might be able to move from geographical place to space, which is different from place. Spaces do not only have a physical existence, they are also social and temporal, or social and historical. And they appear as a result of interaction. Abstract, but I think it makes sense nevertheless. And if we can see how people and places and products interacted to produce these historical spaces, we might get closer to understand Indian Ocean exchange on its own term, rather than, say, on the terms of a cartographer working in Antwerp at the end of the 16th century, or the classicists working in European universities in the colonial period, who have formed much of our discourse in this field. The American geographer Edvard Soja, in turn drawing on the work of the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, operates with 3 categories of space. What he calls first space, or perceived space, also spatial practice. Second space is conceived space, or representations of space. And third space is lived space, or spaces of representation. Perceived space, or first space, is the observable spatial pattern of people and places and things in time. These are the things we can see and count and measure. And this is what geographers have been doing for centuries, all the way back to Ortelius' days, and which archaeologists have become really good at over the last decades with the increased use of GIS technology and remote sensing. We might study, for instance, how ports are distributed on the Indian Ocean coasts, where the harbor facilities, the warehouses, and living quarters were situated in these ports, and what groups were active or resident in different neighborhoods of the ports at different periods of time, based on epigraphy and ceramics or diet and so on. Such patterns emerge from a combination of environmental, pragmatic, and deliberate decisions. Ports, of course, needed water supply. It's not a small issue on much of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean littoral. Natural sheltered anchorage would be a clear advantage. These are environmental factors. How settlements were created would to some extent also rely on pragmatic factors, such as available manpower, expertise, and resources. Other spatial decisions, such as where to place the main temple or the government warehouses, or where the foreign merchants should live, could at least potentially be ascribed to deliberate economic, ideological, or political considerations. While on one side this is close to stating the obvious, I mentioned it because it underlines the point that historical spaces were indeed produced, and that geography, history, and society each had a place in that process. The conceived spaces, the second spaces, or the representation of spaces, are our mental models of the world, as we see it, for instance, in written and visual representations. The text of the Periplus from the 1st century, Ptolemy's geography, the imperial Chinese Han period descriptions of the western regions are all examples of this, as are the Byzantine period maps of the Indian Ocean region from Cosmas Indicopleustes' Christian topography that we will look briefly at later. Ortelius' map of the ancient Indian Ocean is of course also a visualization of conceived space, as are our modern academic concepts, whether we call them sacred landscapes or the German term Lebenswelt. Indeed, any written description of ancient Indian Ocean trade or of a port site on the Indian Ocean seaboard are examples of conceived spaces, as they are produced and imparted by the authors, modern or ancient. To make the whole thing even more complicated, we also approach perceived spaces, the first group I introduced, by means of conceived spaces, because the only way we are able to record and share them are by producing representations of them, whether they are oral, written, or visual. Lived spaces, or spaces of representation, is of course the most difficult to capture, as it's supposed to describe how each and every one of us navigate our physical and social surroundings, including the symbols, ideologies, and power dynamics we surround us with. This is not only very subjective, but it's hard for any of us to have an informed opinion about with regard even to our everyday life, because most of our actions and interactions take place without giving much thought to their symbolic implications, and because lived space is necessarily subjective. An example from the modern-day US, modern-day memorials for Confederate leaders, for some represent heritage and local identity, for others they are symbols of racism and oppression. And this illustrates how history, in this case of the Civil War and slavery, as well as the struggle for civil rights, come together with social groups, minority and majority cultures in physical places. I shall argue later in my talk that we might also attempt to approach the lived spaces of the people who were active in the Indian Ocean in the early history. But before that, I think it goes without saying that although we speak of perceived, conceived, and lived spaces as three categories, they actually overlap. We use tools to measure, describe, and visualize them, and thus they are all representations of space, that is conceived space. Most of them are examples of spatial practice, and thus perceived spaces, and some of them are even lived spaces or spaces of representation, as Soja and Lefebvre would say. Can we transfer this to our study of early exchange in the Indian Ocean? At least in part, I think we may, and I will use the remainder of my talk to offer a few brief examples. We are accustomed to approach our subject by means of maps, and even more perhaps now by satellite images. This goes back to the cartographic revolution of the early modern period that Ortelius was a part of. But really accurate maps of the Indian Ocean littorals were only made in the 19th century for navigation purposes, and in the 20th century for land. And the best maps have in many cases been restricted for military purposes, and high-resolution satellite imagery has only been available for the last decade or so to researchers. Early travelers in the Indian Ocean, of course, most likely never had maps at all. They saw the world from a deck of a ship. And what implications would that have? Our modern tools can help us with that. This is a viewshed of the approach to the Egyptian port of Berenike that Steve will talk about later. Under optimal conditions, you should be able to discern the tallest peaks of the coastal mountains whenever you are inside the red circles on my satellite image. More local, lower landmarks with smaller viewsheds are marked with green circles. I am very aware that these are theoretical measures under optimal conditions, and that conditions are rarely optimal in the real world. Nevertheless, they give an impression of the space that ancient navigators operated within. If you travel on your ship out from Berenike, which is the small yellow needle on the top left, and travel southwards, you can use the small island of the Cape of Ras Banas here, this green circle, as a navigational aid until you see the island of St. John, or Seberget, as it's called in Arabic, further out. When heading home towards Berenike, you could actually rely on keeping as much as you could out of sight of the coastal mountains until you saw the island of Seberget. Keep that on your right hand and continue on that course until you saw the small island outside of Ras Banas. And in that way, you could be safe from reefs. In this way, we are able to move from the perceived space of measurements to the conceived space of representations, our picture here, to try to put ourselves in the lived space of people who were navigating the Red Sea 2 millennia ago and see what decisions they had to make. How did people bring together place, time, and action in such situations. Lionel Casson, the classicist who translated the edition of the Periplus that most of us rely on today, was an ardent sailor himself. In one of his books, I've tried to find the passage again, I've not been able to, but he describes life on the sea as 99% boredom and 1% terror. And it was absolutely critical to know when to take action and thus actively shape this lived space that you were operating in. From the Islamic period, we know of navigational poems that you were supposed to recite so and so many times, and then the relevant sailing marks would appear in sight, and you should know what to do next, provided, of course, that you were reciting at the right pace and that the winds were as they're supposed to be. Until the modern period, sailors have been identifying and naming such marks that would help them to identify their position, and we also have them in the Western Indian Ocean. Two of the more famous are on opposite sides of the Gulf of Aden. Ras Fartak, the Greek Akroterion Syagros, meaning Cape of the Wild Boar, is an almost 900 meters tall headland at the head of Dhofar Bay of present-day Oman. So the name means Cape of the Wild Boar, and theoretically it should be visible almost 100 kilometers offshore. With some goodwill, I have no problems accepting that this could be the shape of a wild boar, and that the name was given because of the shape of the mountain. This, however, is much more evident in the case of Ras Filuk, Akroterion Elephas in Greek, or Cape Elephant on the Somali coast, where the west-facing profile of the 246 meters tall headland leaves little to imagination. I think it's significant that these names are the same in Arabic as they are in Greek and was later taken over by Portuguese navigators. It means that they are at least 2,000 years old and that they have been established and transmitted through time by seafarers. Again, it is an example of how the conceived space of maps and place names can be fixed as perceived space in GIS software and allow us to glimpse the lived space of the people who were navigating the Gulf of Aden 2 millennia ago. How, by the way, did navigators cope when there were no tall mountains shaped like elephants to look for, so that the coast would be hard to spot? This is the situation along the coast of northwestern India, and there sailors would look for changes in the color of the water due to the silt from the mouth of the Indus, and also from the sea snakes that were depicted on Ortelius' map, as they live on shallow water and thus close to the coast. Returning to the concept of the lived space or spaces of representation, one of the traits highlighted by Soja and others is that these landscapes are charged with meaning for the people who navigate them. Naming mountains after animals they resemble are basic examples of this, but much more significant is the investment of political or religious symbolism into places. This little map accompanies manuscripts of the 6th century Christian topography of Cosmos and is a representation of the kingdom of Aksum in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. We do not know whether the map was originally made by Cosmas or if it had been added by the monks who copied the manuscripts at a later stage. 4 versions exist. Ours is a reproduction from a 9th century copy. Being an example of what I've called conceived space, it's a visualization of how an observer understood the part of the text it accompanied. And the map exemplifies how geography and society and history came together in this document. On the left side, we have the Red Sea Littoral here with 3 cities. Adulis, the main port of the Aksumite kingdom, is here. This one is called Gabasta. It's named Telonion, a customs house. And we have an otherwise unknown settlement here called Samidi. Then we have 4 people described as Ethiopic travelers who are walking along the road to Aksum, which is up here. Aksum was the capital of the kingdom. And there are 2 monuments said by Cosmas to be situated along this road outside Adulis. There's a stela from the Greek 3rd century king of Egypt, Ptolemaeus III, commemorating his wars in Syria and the elephant hunts by himself and his father. And there's an inscribed marble throne, this one, believed by Cosmas to also belong to the age of Ptolemy, but demonstrated by modern scholars to commemorate the military exploits of an Axumite king in the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Finally, Cosmas adds that the site of the throne was used as a place of execution in its own times. Although completely useless as a geographical map in our sense of the word, the map does take geography into account in its placement of the sea and the different cities. We just need to appreciate that it's turned upside down, so it would be like this on a modern map. Because unlike our maps, south is on the top. It also reflects a political hierarchy between settlements, and it relates several layers of historical past that were actively used for legitimizing power in Aksum in the 6th century CE. Even to the extent that local criminals were executed in this symbolic presence of kings, both past and present. And in this sense, it certainly also gives insight into the lived spaces or the space of representation of 6th century Ethiopia and Eritrea. My final example is also a map, a modern reconstruction of a late 4th or early 5th century Roman route map known as the Tabula Peutingeriana. This is a section showing southern India and Sri Lanka with the harbour town of Musiris, probably the archaeological site of Pattanam in Kerala. It has a Templum Augusti, a temple of the divine Roman emperors. The central segment of this map, it's a very long document. The central segments that display the Mediterranean are fairly accurate depictions of perceived space. We have the towns with the distances between them, and also, although they are presented in the manner of communication lines rather than in the accurate rendering of distances at landforms, they are more like a modern tube map or network graph. They're quite accurate and useful for traveling. The depiction of South India, however, there is very little accuracy left. In part, this surely reflects inadequate knowledge of the region. In part, it's not intended to be an accurate depiction, but rather to underline the greatness of Rome. And this is one relevant reading of the Roman temple in South India, namely that the Romans were able to pat themselves on their shoulders and say that we are so great that there's even a Roman temple in southern India. This would be a kind of conceived space like Ortelius' map that I started out with. As a depiction of what it was going on in the 4th or 5th century, however, the map is clearly misleading. Rome was Christian at the time, so there were no temples to the emperor, that was a thing of the past, and contacts with South India were, to our knowledge, rather limited. 3 centuries earlier, however, things were different. There was an active, regular, and apparently large-scale traffic between Egypt and South India. Very likely there was a settlement of Roman subjects in Musiris, and very likely these would celebrate the imperial cult there, not as a way of showing any kind of Roman sovereignty in southern India, but simply as a way of maintaining cohesion among themselves, just as Indian merchants would do when they visited the island of Socotra, where hundreds of Indic inscriptions, many with Brahmanic connotations and some with Buddhist, have been found along with Ethiopic, Greek, South Arabian, and even one Palmyrene inscription in a sanctuary in the cave of Hok. In this way, the map does make sense, but only in the context with what else we know about the historical, social, and geographical environment of the region. Summing up, what I've argued this morning is that thinking in terms of spatiality is a useful way of approaching all the data that we have amassed about places, products, and people in early Indian Ocean trade. And it's useful especially for 2 reasons. First, it forces us to relocate our focus to the places where things happened, on a beach, in a coastal city, or on the deck of a ship, rather than watching them, as we all too often do, from metropolitan perspectives that have produced many of our sources and most of the historiography. In this way, we place the Indian Ocean where it belongs, in the center. Second, being forced to think about how physical environment, social environment, and historical setting come together and influence each other is useful because it allows us to move emphasis from the static nature of our evidence to the dynamic processes that produced it, which we need to do if we want to understand the historical dynamics that were at work in early Indian Ocean trade. I will end my talk on that note. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm looking very much forward to our discussions over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
The next speaker, Stephen Sidebotham. I want to be you one day, having Berenike and excavating and wonderful work that you have been doing. So, Stephen Sidebotham, Professor of Ancient History and Archaeology at the University of Delaware. We know him as one of the best archaeologists in the world. I'll put you in one of the 5 best archaeologists in the world. His knowledge is vast, and he teaches courses on the ancient Near East, Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Greek and Roman sports and recreation, ancient religion, and a seminar on World War II, and with your wife, that I admire your work that you have been doing on oral tradition on the Second World War. Fluent in Arabic, Professor Sidebotham was educated in Egypt, Greece, and United States, and received a Ph.D. at the University of Michigan, 1981. He has excavated or undertaken archaeological survey work in Italy, Greece, Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel, and India. And since 1972 has participated in or directed over 60 field projects, both on land and underwater. Professor Sidebotham's main research interest is ancient trade and cultural exchanges between Mediterranean Basin, Near East on the one hand, and the Red Sea, Indian Ocean littoral on the other. He has written, co-authored, co-edited 13 books. I'm not going to read all of them, Steve, right? So, especially the one, the Red Land, the Illustrated Archaeology of Egypt, Eastern Desert, with Martin Hanser, published in 2008. His most recent book is on his primary area of research, Berenike and the ancient maritime spice route, published by the University of California, Berkeley. So yesterday when we were having drinks, you were talking to us about the latest finding. I'm very curious to know what they are. And let me invite you. So today's talk will be Berenike's role in the ancient maritime Silk Road based on results of recent excavation. Thank you, Steve.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Hard to know how much, we've been working here since 1994, so I'm going to try to cram a lot into a little time. Berenike is really a microcosm of what we're going to be looking at today. The port was functioned for 800 years. And we can only really look at the last 550 because there's simply no time to look at what was going on in the Hellenistic period, unfortunately. As you can see here, it was absolutely centrally located and pivotal to this exchange. I don't want to call it just trade because, of course, it was people's products and ideas that were flowing back and forth between the Mediterranean basin on the one hand and the Northwest Indian Ocean on the other. And, of course, any movement into or out of the port necessitated a good knowledge of the wind patterns. You're all familiar with the wind patterns in the Indian Ocean. You may not be as familiar with them in the Red Sea, but they're extremely powerful northerlies in the area of Berenike. These had to be considered when coming to or from the port. A number of maps and satellite images. It's located roughly 825 kilometers south-southeast of Suez, and about 260 kilometers east of Aswan. This map, just made recently by a friend of mine, shows the 119 trenches plus extensions that we have dug over the years. It looks impressive, but in fact, only 2% of the site has been excavated. So for yet unborn generations, there's work. One of the things that has allowed us to do, place our trenches really with maximum results has been the creation of a magnetic map. For those of you who aren't familiar, basically an X-ray of what's beneath the soil for about 1 meter to 1.5 meters. And this has allowed us to place trenches accordingly. So you see the little red circle off to the left here. I think you can all see that. So, like I said, I'm going to avoid talking about the Ptolemaic period, not because it's disinteresting, but we don't have time. So after the Ptolemaic military facilities and hydraulic installations were abandoned, this part of the site was converted into a cemetery. And you're going to find human burials and remains scattered all across the site. They're not placed in one particular location. So I'll show you some of these individuals. Of course, preservation here is superb, as you might imagine, in an arid climate. Here's a man. He's still wearing an iron ring, as you see there. And the two on the left, same individual, older man. The arrows are pointing to beads. That should get someone's attention here. And an iron ring. And the lady on the right has a amphora over her head. These are all early Roman burials in the Ptolemaic area. And as you left town, this is more common in the Roman period. There's a cemetery on the road leading to the Nile. And the little girl there in the cis grave is 2 years old, and she did have a burial shroud and beads accompanying. Got it. The most useful, or one of the most useful places for our digging has been the trash dump, which is also an early Roman animal cemetery. And I would say 95% at least of all the written documents that we've found have been found here. And they come in a number of media, and it's important to understand that these differences aren't just physical, but they also relate to what's being recorded on them. The papyri are basically private documents, letters, bills of sale, poems, things like this, while the ostraca are mainly public records. And these include things like the toll house customs, what's passing through. On the other hand, also water. Someone mentioned how important it is. Absolutely. The Roman army controlled it. Its acquisition, storage, and distribution in the city, as we know from these ostraca here. Again, as I said, human burials appearing all over the place, and the trash dump is no exception. Here's half of a 25-year-old man. And then what's extremely interesting is our pet cemetery. We know that we have several hundred animals buried here, and while initially we thought, oh, they may have just died here, we now know, in fact, that they were actively buried here. And if you look at this one dog here, he was 4 years old when he passed. We know he had bone cancer when he died. Now, numerically, the largest number of animals are felines, or cats and kittens. Secondly, dogs and puppies. And then a distant third and fourth, we have baboons, we have monkeys, and we have a bird. How do we know they're pets? Well, active burial. Also, some of them are wearing collars. So if you look at the red arrows or red circles, the collar is made of iron on the left, beads on the right, or a combination of iron collars and beads. And this is found not just on cats. We find it on some of the monkeys. So here's a grivet monkey. We have a number of grivet monkeys. And again, the arrow is pointing to an iron collar, and the map will show you the range of the grivet monkey. So obviously close to Egypt, it would have been an easy animal to import for domestic purposes. And of course, this does indicate somebody at the site had sufficient funds to be able to support an animal in such a desiccated environment. Here's a recent find. We're not sure yet if it's a dwarfed goat or an ibex. They're still working on that. Beads, this will excite somebody in the crowd. Beads, lots of them, thousands of them, mainly from very early and late Roman contexts, in all kinds of media. Lots of glass, gilded glass, millefiori glass. We have precious and semi-precious stones. Bottom right, of course, Indo-Pacific beads. Of great interest is the bead from Jatim in eastern Java, unfortunately a surface find. But the closest parallels are from Jatim, and they are basically in the 5th centuries and 6th centuries AD. Some of the preservation is so excellent that we still have, as you can see, the beads on their original strings, so we've not restrung these. Matting and basketry you don't think as being very exciting, and what do they really tell us? But in fact, we found some matting and a weaving pattern used until today in the Thar Desert of Rajasthan. And we suspect these were probably either awnings used on board the ships or possibly sails. So in fact, that's informative. And of course, given the dry climate, we have a lot of, again, organic material, which you see here is, again, I can only show you a small snippet of the finds. Lots of cordage made of various materials, fishing nets, fish net weights, and so on. There was industry at the port, but it wasn't heavy duty. There was working of turtle shell, which you see in the upper left. There was leather working. The items in the bottom right were not made at Berenike. They're probably reinforcements for tents or for sails or for animal girths. And at the upper right, you have the lead stamp on a rope that probably was used to seal a box. On the bottom left there, a little Isis figure. The third major medium, so we looked at papyri, we've looked at ostraca, are jar stoppers. Again, made in many media. These particular ones are plaster, and they're interesting because, as you see, they're stamped and or painted. And these provide the names of either the shippers or the people who own the contents of the jars. And of course, studying these, you can reconstruct trade patterns back primarily to the Nile and to the Fayum oasis. Coins, this is my particular area, and surprisingly we found very few, less than 700 at a port like this. But together with the ceramic evidence, the epigraphic evidence, the coins and so on, we can reestablish peaks and valleys in the trade. And certainly the absolute peak is the 1st and early 2nd centuries AD. No one's surprised by that. What you're going to be surprised about is the second peak, very, very strong, starts in the middle of the 4th century AD. Extensive evidence for trade coming in from India and South Arabia and other areas of Africa beginning in the 4th, especially in the mid-4th century AD on. And then, anyway, I'll tell you more about that. So let's sort of go from west to east. Let's take a look at the goods that actually reflect these trade patterns. I think many of you, if you're a classical archaeologist, you recognize these. This fancy terra sigillata ware made in Italy and Gaul and so on in the west. From the early Roman period. But of course, fine wares at almost any archaeological site are usually minimal, and certainly at port sites, what we have the most of are amphoras, these shipping and storage containers, and depending, of course, on their shapes, their fabrics, their sizes, you can accurately record their provenances and then, of course, reconstruct a trade pattern. So we know that Berenike had extensive contacts throughout the Mediterranean, throughout its history, as far west as the Iberian Peninsula and northwest Africa. Glass, we all know that the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea talks about the export of glass from Egypt to southern Arabia and to India, and we have thousands and thousands of sherds of glass. And a lot of it's very high quality. We've got mold-blown glass, we have cut glass, we have Millefiori glass, we have painted glass. That marine scene on the upper right there is particularly attractive. And just to show you, again, I can only touch on it. The pillar bowls, of course, are found all over the place. Get some idea of the quality, and if not the quantity of the glass that we have been finding. Now, as we move south and east away from the Mediterranean, there's, of course, extensive. We find a lot of this. The botanical remains are extremely informative of the trade. They're often overlooked or not studied sufficiently. You get an idea of what Boswellia looks like on the left. As I said, this is the genus for frankincense species. We can't break it down any more than that. And you see some images of some of the other incense that we have found. We've even found a shaped piece of Boswellia wood, which you see here. And if you look very closely, you can still see the little globules of frankincense stuck to it. Other evidence of trade, or contacts rather, I hate to use the word trade, but contacts with southern Arabia. We found a number of graffiti in Hadramati, which is a pre-Islamic South Arabian language. This is a small but growing corpus. Most of it is from the early Roman period. As we move, again, I'm moving sort of in a southeasterly direction, and we come to the Indian subcontinent. We have probably quantitatively of all of the non-Roman material at the site, South Asian is the second most. Peppercorns, as you all know, pepper was a major export commodity from the Western Ghats, probably via Muziris to the west. And way back in the 90s, we found this jar. We'd already found thousands of peppercorns. We found this jar, it's the one without the lid here, that contained over 7.5 kilos of black peppercorns. So that's the largest hoard found anywhere in the Mediterranean, but not to be left out. Abrus precatorius seeds, highly toxic, usually mixed with frankincense to keep the frankincense from congealing together. The analogy here would be the use of rice in a salt shaker today. Lots of coconut husks. These, of course, could come from any place in the Indian Ocean. They're at all levels at Berenike in the Roman period. Mung beans. I mean, there's a lot of other botanical materials that I have no time to get into. Textiles. We have a number of Indian textiles. This one's particularly interesting, this resist-dyed cotton textile found in a 5th century trash dump. at Berenike. And if you look, there's a very nice analogy from cave number 17 in Ajanta. You can see circled in red there, it's exactly the same kind of design. And just to let you know, I was on the Silk Road in China a few years ago, and in a museum in Urumqi had an exact one of these as well. So clearly the Indians were producing large quantities of this material and exporting it extensively. Beads, lots of beads, most of them semi-precious that are easily identifiable in the top left there from the subcontinent. The blue stone on the right is a sapphire, either from southern India or Sri Lanka, and of course the omnipresent cameo blanks from northwest India. These appear in some numbers at our site, probably eventually destined for a workshop in Alexandria. Unfortunately, unlike India, where we have, or even Sri Lanka, where there's thousands of Roman coins, we have very few Indian coins in the West. We've only found 2 at our site. This is one we just got in January, this past January. It's been identified by an individual from the Ashmolean. You can see, of course, the extent of the Satavahana Empire there on the map. And then the only other Indian coin is the silver one from the 4th century, and you could look at the map off to the right for the location of that coin. As we move into Africa and sort of that area to the south of Egypt, the Aksumites start making their real appearance in Berenike in the very late 3rd, early 4th century, about the time that their empire, of course, starts to make an impression on this international trade that we are so interested in. So there's a coin of the last pre-Christian king of Aksum. And again, we have a growing corpus of Aksumite pottery from the site. And the more we dig, the more we turn up, of course. Not huge quantities, but enough. We have thousands and thousands of textiles, and while some are from India, the subcontinent, of course, most come from Egypt or from other areas of the Near East or from the Mediterranean world. Now this is that's exciting, but what I'm about to tell you is over the top, okay? And that is excavation at this Isis temple. This had been known since the earliest European rediscovery of the site in the 19th century. So we, as a result of that, and they're digging there, we decided we're not going to work here, which is a big mistake. We finally decided maybe we should take another look, and we did. So here's our magnetic map circling the location of this temple, which we now know for certain is dedicated to Isis. And based on what we found this year, we've done this tentative reconstruction of the temple and the courtyard. The closest parallel is, in fact, a temple in Nubia, Dabad, which now sits in Madrid, of course. And so let me show you what we found. Like all temples in antiquity, they were not just places of worship. They were places where you'd store curiosities or antiquities. And one of the most interesting has to be this Middle Kingdom stele fragments, which sort of join up with the trade to Punt in the Middle Kingdom in the 18th century BC. We're now pretty certain Berenike was probably a stopover point for people traveling between Mersagawa Seas up there and Punt in this period. Other antiquities, this one we just found this year, this 13th to 7th century BC Egyptian crown made of limestone. And the black and white is not one we found. This is found by earlier investigators. We know that the temple was probably originally Ptolemaic, so we're not terribly surprised that we found this. However, this season, you see a plan of the trenches, mainly from this season. We had the entrance to the site, which you see the 2 columns are circled in red, and they coincide with this here. And then here are 2 views overall. The top one shows a view from east to west, the bottom from west to east. So we have a courtyard area and then rooms inside the temple itself, and there is a distinct difference. It was very surprising. So some other views, mainly of the courtyard area. The temple was very nicely roofed with carved stone ceilings of 5-pointed stars that were painted. As you'll see in a few minutes, also hieroglyphs and figural scenes. The courtyard area, we found well over 24 inscriptions, all in Greek. Some of them are too big to move. The 6 that you see the arrows on are simply too large to move. All of these in Greek are from the Roman period. They date from the middle of the 1st to the middle, surprisingly, of the 3rd century AD. So let me just give you a very quick view of only some of the texts. Some of these we found in 2015. Most of these we found this past January and February. As I said, they're all dating from the middle of the 1st to the middle of the 3rd century. They're all in Greek. They're dedications by local individuals who are named, very useful, and dedicated in most instances to Isis. And then they go on to say why they're being dedicated. So in many instances, it's for the safe return of a voyage. It's for the safety of the crew. Well, where do you think they're coming from, right? So it's very interesting. Here's one that records the actual presence of an aromatics warehouse at the site, which we have yet to find. So obviously now we're going to be busy trying to find that. Here's some ones clearly from the carving techniques. Some people had more money to donate than others. Virtually all of these are dedicated to Isis in one of her many guises. This man, Marcus Lilios Cosmos, actually we have 3 inscriptions from him. I'm only showing you 2. So clearly he had lots of money to dedicate to Isis on behalf, again, of his crew. And as we move into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it's pretty much more of the same, with the personal names being very important. It gives us the names of some of these individuals actually engaged in this trade activity. And it goes on into the 3rd century, especially in the late 2nd, early 3rd, as you can see here. And then very surprisingly, and I asked our epigrapher several times, are you certain about that identification on the right? He said, yes. So in the middle of the 3rd century, when things seem to be going very badly elsewhere, we have a growing corpus of epigraphic, numismatic, and ceramic evidence telling us Berenike was still functioning. And we have to assume because there was trade passing through. Now, so on the outside, in the courtyard, we have Greek. In the inside, we have predominantly hieroglyphs. And again, the roof beam that you see there on the bottom, nicely carved with the same kind of stars. You've got also a text that very specifically says the temple is dedicated to Isis of Coptos, a city on the Nile. The interior rooms, decorated with all kinds of reliefs, obviously some of them in very bad shape. And at the lower levels of the walls in better shape, the preservation of the lotus and papyrus plants. The drawing there is done by one of those early 19th century explorers who dug into this area. And we know they were there archaeologically. We can have a whole separate archaeology of the 19th century diggers because they discarded beer bottles, wine bottles, shoes, buttons. So we're going to have a whole separate chapter on these guys from the 19th century. More of the roof decoration here. So you can see it wasn't some small-scale building. It was a very important, they lavished a lot of money and attention on this building over an extended period of time, which is a nice reflection, of how wonderful Berenike was at the time and how extensive the trade was as well. Even the insides, the door jambs are decorated, as you see here. The area circled in red was added after the decoration, and it's by a private individual. And you can see where it fits in with the arrow there, written during the reign of the Emperor Titus, 79 to 81 AD. Sculpture, we had tons, I shouldn't say that, that's a hyperbole. We had a lot of sculpture. As you can see here, we're overwhelmed. We need an art historian to look at this. The lady on the right, though, had gilding left in her hair. So some of the statuary was gilded. So again, there's an indication that somebody had a lot of money to pour into the site. These male heads, the one on the left may be one of the Dioscuri, hard to say. One on the right, clearly a Roman emperor in the guise of an Egyptian pharaoh. We know that Isis wasn't the only deity worshipped here. Serapis is often found in temples in Egypt associated with Isis, and as you can see, we have evidence for his presence here, some nice heads, together with his symbol. His symbol was a human footprint, so we have several altars also dedicated to him. So again, not a surprise to find him associated with Isis in this temple. Some of the other sculpture, that's a 50 centimeter scale to give you an idea. This seated statue, of course, we don't know who this is. We're speculating that it might be Serapis. This white marble statue that may be a late Roman consul. As I said, we're working on this. And some other fragments. So again, I can't show you everything. This is a sampling of, you can see the feet on the bottom there, parts of larger statues in the Harpocrates figure. Another nude male torso. Osiris, of course, you'd expect him here, consort of Isis. And Aphrodite figurine, question mark. That's all new material. You're the first people to see that. aside from the reports that I sent out. Now this is old material, the Palmyrenes, but it's interesting, this shrine here, we dug in the 90s. It's again a multi-cult shrine like most shrines at Berenike are. We have this bronze statue of a female, that's her arm. She fits into this overall scheme here of the statue-based inscription. The inscription's in Greek, but it dates from September 215 AD. It mentions an archer in the auxiliaries, a Palmyrene archer named Marcus Aurelius Mokimos, and he's making a dedication to the Roman imperial cult, which is one of several cults worshipped. We then have a bilingual in Palmyrene and Greek, again by Roman military dedicators. They're talking about the Palmyrene god Yarhabal, and that's the larger one in red there. The smaller is the name of the artist, Berenike, who carved it. And all that's left is of Yarhabal is his hand and the impressions where his statue in bronze once stood. Again, we found a Harpocrates head here. You can see the reclining sphinx recycled into the wall. So again, a multiple cult shrine, which seems to be what we find for the most part at Berenike. And some more altars. We have these stone altars and bowls all over the place. I mean, they're just very common. Now, when we get to the actual maritime side of things, even the harbor is multi-use. There's industrial activity going on here. There's trash dumping activity going on here. There is maritime, fortunately, going on, and religious. So again, a quick snapshot. Manufacturing is they're manufacturing copper of some kind. We have these crucibles that indicate that, and the slide below the crucibles is the area where we found them, so the work area, on top of which was dumped trash. The iron nails are very commonly found in ship construction, so not a surprise there. We found a number of interesting intaglios. Some of these are not from the harbor, but I put them in here anyhow. They're all early Roman, except for the red one, which is late Hellenistic, so that one dates 2nd into the 1st BC. Going back to South Arabia, since we can't seem to escape it and we're in the harbor, we found these black stones laying right on the surface, and analysis showed that they're vesicular basalt, probably used as ship's ballast, and chemical analysis shows they are from Kana in South Arabia. So clearly these were being put on board ships, coming from Kana, perhaps bearing cargoes of frankincense, or of course they were ships transiting from India via Kana, and when they arrived at Berenike, of course they dumped their ballast here. A number of ship remains from the early Roman period. We have remains of ship hulls in cedar. Those are large ocean-going ropes, very, very thick, up to 7 centimeters in diameter, 13 meters long. When we did surgery on the wood, it turned out that the timbers were made in a mortise and tenon construction technique, which is absolutely typical of the Mediterranean. So at least at this point we know in the early Roman period, some of the ships sailing the Red Sea were built in a typical Mediterranean fashion. And then this frame that we found in 2014, a nice little addition to the corpus. Interestingly, in the late Roman period, no ship timbers in the harbor. We find them recycled into the walls of the buildings, and they're not made of cedar, they're made of teak. And it was a very common tradition in Egypt to recycle dismantled ships into architecture. So this is in keeping with a millennia-old tradition. And as you see here in the shrine of the Palmyrenes, those two images are of the same wood. You can see the mortise holes there that clearly indicate it must have been taken from a dismantled ship. In addition to teak wood beams, we found part of an iron anchor recycled into the wall. So if you look at the white circle there. And so, clearly an interest in the sea. You see that little anchor graffito on a potsherd there. Going to the northern shrine, and we're not as interested in the northern shrine for the religion that's going on here. We don't know what cult was worshipped here. There it is, and we don't know who's the primary or even the secondary deity here. What we're interested in is the recycling of the teak wood beams again. And that one at the back that you see here is over 3 meters long. It's the longest single beam that we have. And if you look closely, here are some details. You can see that, again, the mortise joints for the ship. So we're pretty sure these were from dismantled ships from the late Roman period. So from the 4th or 5th century. There's no reason to recycle early Roman ships into late Roman buildings. That makes no sense. And of course, the whole array of maritime material. You see a graffito there, early Roman, lifting net, brailing rings, for moving the sails up and down. These are made of bone and animal horn and wood. Sails themselves, I wish someone would ask me about these because our textile people think they're actually Indian made. And then the lead sheeting there is very common to sheath ancient merchant ships, as you all know, in either lead or copper. Back to the Roman harbor, we seem to be bouncing around, but I'll get to the religious part now because this is extremely fascinating. The temple that we found here, again, late Roman, contemporary with the shrine I just showed you in the northern shrine. Here's several views of it under excavation. And what's so unique about this, the temple itself is not exciting, the contents are. Most temples, Egyptian temples on the Nile, have been completely cleaned out of their finds. This one was not. In addition to the artifacts, we also have botanical dedications, so we know what's being dedicated here. So first off, just quickly, the red arrow points to the inscription you see at the bottom left. It's 1st century, recycled. A whole bunch of other things there, no time to talk about. The green arrow is very interesting. It points to a little jar in the corner, and you go, that's a little jar in the corner, who cares? Until you open it up, and then you care, because it has a hoard of 50 silver lunate-shaped, repoussé decorated pieces with little nails, and clearly it had been nailed to something, a box, perhaps the prow of a ship, we'll never know. We'll never know. Inside that same small shrine, a patera, you can see with the iron tripod legs still attached, and you see it pointed out, its location, it's in situ, find the red arrow. The green arrow points to altars, more altars, and the one on the far right is in fact in Aksumite South Arabian style. Some of the other finds, like I said, it's just overwhelming. For me to try to squeeze this into 30 minutes is ridiculous, but lots of ostrich eggshells with painting. These are magical incantations. The stone thing at the top there is a Meroitic libation table. We find these all over Berenike. They are from Upper Nubia. Lower Nubia, incense burner on the bottom right. And the stars are one of the symbols of Isis. So we, again, shouldn't be surprised. Isis, if you know anything about classical archaeology, she's the protector of sailors and sailing and so on and so forth. So makes all the sense in the world, of course, to have a temple to her, as well as others down here. Some of the little statuary, as you can see, a humanoid figure. The bull is interesting because the closest parallel there is actually with southern Arabia, 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD. A little Bess figurine, so the Egyptians are here as well. The black stone has been a mystery to us. Is it a beetle, the kind of things you would find in an Arabian context? We're not sure. And then the thing in the circle in the ground is the tip of a reef, so it may be representative of a ben from Egyptian religion. I said a lot of botanical remains, but the most interesting and the most numerous are these. They're seeds of the lotus flower. And if you look, all the little black dots there, those are all the seeds of the lotus flower. And we also found the flower pot, which you see there. And in case you're not sure what a lotus flower looks like, I put one in there for you. So clearly the dedications, botanically speaking, would have made the interior look pretty interesting. And then right next to it, we've got this huge enigma. Every time I give a talk like this, I show this and ask anybody if they know what it might be. Nobody does. This sunken feature into which were thrown 1st to 4th century AD objects, including inscriptions, statue parts, bricks, painted ostrich eggshells, you name it. And the red arrow, in fact, points to the inscription you see here of a late 1st century emperor, and then evidence of bronze statuary. You can see those eye insets and then a digit. Where the rest of the statues are, who knows. This year, using again the magnetic survey, we had a very interesting area we dug at the intersection of 2 streets. We thought there might be a major monument here, and we dug, in fact, that's what we found. We have the pylon there in the bottom right of a large street monument, which we think might be a tetrapylon or a tetrachonion. And you see a tentative reconstruction of that. So Roman cities in the Near East often had these kinds of decorations. It's just surprising to find it, or not surprising, depending on your point of view here. Late Roman period, as I said, there's a huge revival of the trade, especially in the middle of the 4th century and into the 5th. And we have tons of evidence of this. This isn't just 1 or 2 things. We have lots of pottery, lots of beads, lots of architecture, lots of trash, and lots of coins. And the arrow there points to the center, the heartbeat of the city at this time in the period around 400. Lots of buildings, multiple storied buildings, as you'll see. The commonality is the staircases leading to the upper stories, the niches, which are lined with, guess what, teak wood, shelving, again, possibly recycled. As I said, the commonality here, the staircases, you can see them in an artist's reconstruction of how we think this particular building looked. A lot of the stone has been recycled clearly from earlier structures. Again, some more views here. Ariane will recognize her trench at the bottom right there, which is not in this part of town, but it's obviously from this same date. This is near the harbor. And in the bottom left, you see some roof beams that would have separated the ground floor from the upper floor that have clearly just fallen. Not a surprise, finally, where are the warehouses? You know, you're trading. So here it is. As the harbor silted up in late antiquity, activities moved east, and you can see this warehouse with these easily dated Isla Aqaba amphores to right around the period of 400. In very late period, it becomes more ghettoized. We have two different population groups, two major population groups. A sea-oriented one, we know this from the faunal remains. A desert-oriented one, again, we know from the faunal remains. And from this very interesting eastern desert ware. And that's one of the languages we've never been able to figure out. It's one of our 12. So if anybody has an idea. And then the church, you can't, go without having one of those. And you say, well, how do we know? Well, the contents are overwhelmingly indicative of that. We have a number of oil lamps with crosses, Christian aphorisms, and so on. In the very late period, as the city does not die some horrible catastrophic death, it dies a natural old age. After 800 years you've had it, it's time to move on. Let's find something else. And the final inhabitants here, who may have been only ephemeral, built these, so we love to call them banana walls, because they're basically in the shape of bananas. So by the middle of the 5th century, the city's abandoned. It's not reused in the Islamic period. And so let me just briefly sort of categorize what's going on here. With all of the finds, and I've enumerated briefly some of them, there's several peak periods. You got the foundation in the early 3rd century to the middle of the 2nd. That's the first peak. You then have a nadir until you get to the early Roman period. So first, second, early second, you have the absolute acme of activity at the site, and then it starts to decrease. And then you have a mini revival in the late 2nd, early 3rd, and then sort of a deep nadir in the 3rd into the middle of the 4th, when you have the final major renaissance at the site. And then later 5th and into the 6th, of course, it steadily slides into decline. Why does this decline? Possibly a plague that we know from Procopius passed through here, possibly silting of the harbors that they didn't bother to try to dredge, possibly just simply outcompeted by the Oxumites and the Indians. We really don't know. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions if we have time.
So let me introduce our last speaker for the morning session, Professor Kusimba. And you want us to call you Chap? Yeah. Right, okay. So he's professor of the Department of Anthropology, American University. Professor Kusimba holds his degree from Brian Ph.D. and Kenyatta University, Nairobi. His specialties include the archaeology of complex societies and origins of inequality, ancient African chiefdoms and states, urbanism in Africa, Islam in Africa, and the African diaspora in Asia and the Americas. He directs multiple anthropological research projects in East Africa and Madagascar. His current project, based on Kenya coast, is investigating ancient trade networks between East Africa, Southeast Asia, Southeast and East Asia. He is the director and co-director of a number of research projects, including ancient trade between China and East Africa, and also Chwal Palshet Archaeological Program in Pune, in India, and the Mount Elgin Anthropological Research Program in Kenya and Uganda. And I just heard when I met you this morning, you were elected to the American Academy this year. Right? Among his book, especially the one that I really like, is The Rise and Fall of Swahili States, African Archaeology series, deals with the Swahili civilization, which was fascinating and complex system, a group of advanced cultures with large economic networks International Maritime Trade, and Urban Sophistication. This book documents the growth of Swahili civilization on the eastern coast of Africa from 100 BC to the time of European colonization in the 16th century. Using archaeological, anthropological, and historical information, Professor Kusimba described the origins of unique and powerful culture, including its Islamic components, architecture, language, and trading. So may I invite you to deal with this talk, please.
Thanks, Osmond, and thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me here. I think that a few years ago we didn't know as much as we do today. But I think the problem that we face still is just knowing the kinds of questions we ask and whether the kinds of these questions that we are asking today help us understand the past or obfuscate it even more. And I think that asking the right questions is an ongoing field. And as I was thinking about this, I think we've been working on both sides of this region almost in isolation. And so in most cases, we do not know what is really going on. For example, I learned so much from Stephen's work. I've read Stephen's work, but I think just listening to him, you get the sense of just how much has been done. And with every slide, a lot of questions were going on in my mind, what this might actually mean just looking a few thousand miles further south. And so in thinking about this, this talk actually segues very well from where Steve is ending, because I think that the decline and collapse of Berenike essentially ushers in the rise of the Asian century, which is immediately a few centuries before the rise of Islam, all the way to the time of European conquest of the Indian Ocean. And in East Africa, where we work for the last 1,200 years, most of the people who live at the coast that we study essentially are Muslim. And so beginning from North Africa all the way to northern Mozambique, most of the communities that live along the coastline essentially over the last 1,000 years have been Muslim. But within that area, there's still, the majority of the people still retained traditional African religions and ways of living. So many ways, I think, if you look at the Swahili coast, this is essentially what you might be able to see. You have Muslim people, but you have communities that mainly eke their subsistence from both the land and the sea. And in a lot of ways, I think the way in which we have looked at the history of these places, there has been a tendency perhaps to disregard some of the connections. But I think that in looking at this larger area, one has to look at, in general, the shared cultural connections that one finds among peoples who live in these areas that we're talking about, all the way from North Africa to Central Asia. If you look at, for example, pastoral communities today, there's certain shared affinities. That if you are in a Tuareg household and you go on to Mongolia, there might be certain similarities that these people meeting and talking to each other might not see major differences between them. And I think if you look at some of the places like in the Gulf states, East Africa, those affinities do in fact exist. And I think that this is what really excites us today, in the sense of looking at and finding out the nature of the connections. Today, these connections are seen in mostly unequal terms, but were they always unequal? As the inequities that we see today, were they always that way? And in ways in which we see the world today, is it quite possible that in fact in our own erasure of the histories of many of these communities, current politics not influencing the way in which we read the past and things like that? Distance matters. And I think in most cases, I think when we're thinking about influences, we have to think about all local in a lot of ways. So archaeologically, for the most part, it might be much easier to publish, for example, rare exotica. But I think that deep down, we all know that the majority of what we always look at, things that we don't often pay a lot of attention, things that Stephen has been speaking to, are always local. So in most cases, I think when you look at any region of the world, perhaps 95% of everything that is produced is usually local. What gets into nature is that exotica, right? So we're turning things around. So when we're talking about the 1% or the 10% that eventually become the standard bearer of these communities, what about the 95% that we are silencing? This is really what we do today, and I think that we can actually see that. But the period that is really significant for me is when you look at the period between 300 BC to at least 1700 CE. There's something going on during these last 2,000 years. One is that if you just look at this bar chart here, it shows you increasing stability in terms of the reign of leadership. Right? Kings and queens are ruling over a much longer period. What does that mean? This means that there's increasing stability so that people can make long-term plans. Traders, merchants, entrepreneurs can make long-term plans. You can build alliances because the king is always going to be there for a much longer period. And this has major, major ramifications for the point that we are looking at. So what happens in the Asian Renaissance during the period between 700 and 1400? You see major, major advances, both in politics and in science. And in many ways, I think what we know today, if you look at politics, bureaucracies and tax codes are established. You have the development of manuals for kings. If you look at science, you have major, major advances in medicine, in mathematics, in astronomy. This is happening during this time. And I think that we have to be able to be thinking about these kinds of innovations and the impact that they have for, in fact, everyday life, such as the ones that we see in the archaeological record. So what are we looking at when you look at this Indian Ocean maritime system? We see major, at least three distinct regions where, in fact, these kinds of interactions are going on. And of course, because of distances, each of these centers is dominated by a particular group. So when we're thinking about East Africa, this is an area where I'm mostly interested in. The west coast of India and Persian Gulf and East Africa is dominated by Persians, Arabs, and Swahili traders. Right? So any evidence of East Asia might actually be indirect, but there might be occasions where an indefatigable traveler might find their way hop from one dhow to the next until they find themselves in East Africa. Probably they might feel that they have found a good place to stay. I think going back to what Steve has basically mentioned, which is when you look at these areas and you begin putting them together, when goods and services are moving in different directions, well, suddenly I think certain materials are becoming dominant in particular places. So in East Africa, for example, ivory, timber, gold, iron, tortoise shells, quartz, leopard skins, frankincense, and myrrh, among others, are some of the major trade items that are involved in this Indian Ocean global exchange. But in the long run, I'm much less interested in materials, but I'm interested in what is actually coming and what is enduring. What is enduring that we see in all these regions is that technologies, tastes in terms of cuisine, and knowledge is moving across this huge area. Right? Today, for example, when you look at certain knowledges, like very, very esoteric, like the knowledge of silkworm raising that you find among the Swahili coast, that you find in Madagascar, much of this knowledge, in fact, came all the way from East Asia and is still very much enduring. You will not find it archaeologically, but nonetheless, it's there. And it gives you indications of what might be going on beyond just what is preserved in the archaeological record, beads, porcelain, and all of that. right? But in the food that people eat today, if you are in East Africa and you are in India, you are in Malaysia, the smells, those smells always, it's not just nutmeg, but they remind you of those traditions that are hidden, that have been passed on intergenerationally, that still persist today. We talked about some of those connections. I think that those are clearly, but in East Africa, what I want to find out, and I think that my project has always been looking at what role did East Africans play in this Indian Ocean trading system. And I think until very recently, I think most of the work has sort of silenced the African connections, contributions to this. Even subaltern scholars have tended to write off Africa, even as they decry sort of the Western exclusion of the Near East into this one. But they have also, in many ways, excluded the African component, sometimes actively so. So the time that we are looking at, this is what we've been able to find. These are some of the towns that existed around this period that we're talking about. Along the east coast of Africa, we have identified at least 400 towns and cities. In Southeast Africa, where most of the work is being done by colleagues in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, and others, you see this landscape that's being developed. I think in East Africa, we haven't done as much, but I think that when this is all said and done, we're going to essentially see a landscape that in many ways is part of that maritime landscape that we love to talk about. What I see in terms of rural and urban interactions in coastal East Africa is essentially an interaction spheres that develop, are passed on intergenerationally, and I think a lot of those interaction spheres become disrupted during the colonial period, but they persisted for a very long time in many ways. These interaction spheres are generally in the form of, during the time of the rise of the maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, we also see major investments in inland Africa, where you see major innovations in large-scale iron production centers. These are the ones I found in coastal hinterland, about 200 kilometers from the coast. In Great Zimbabwe, colleagues there have found evidence of large investments in gold and gold mining. Of course, this is in response to the demand for African products that is increasing in Asia, as of course these empires in the Near East and in South Asia and in China begin to advance. So how are the rich people in East Africa faring on? Actually, they're faring on quite well. We see major advances in major developments of urbanism. This is along the coast. This is the National Monument of Gede that dates to at least 1000 AD. We see major innovations in terms of tomb architecture. These are tombs of elite women, and of course, these are tombs of elite men. You move into the hinterland, you basically see the emergence of large-scale urban systems like the Great Zimbabwe. And so these are all happening more or less at the same time. And so if you put this all together, one of the exciting things about Africa is that there's this idea of, even as cities arise along here and some around, in places where we have tended to look, there is also this relationship that I've called mosaics that tends to develop, where these mosaics or interaction spheres seem to be more about knowledge than, in fact, build up space. So that, in fact, people are much more interested in hanging on, holding on certain forms of knowledge that they hold sway, that enable them to exchange goods and products with each other. So for example, here, these are hunter-gatherers that are basically not your ordinary hunter-gatherers, but these are basically very highly specialized hunter-gatherers who are hunters who are hunting and killing the elephants that people need. And in order to look at their knowledge, they basically develop a very potent poison that they're able to use to hunt. And so the poison that the Sanye, for example, I've worked with these communities, developed was able to kill an elephant in 15 minutes, an adult elephant in 15 minutes. And so it's a very efficient tool. And the Sanye became so important during the age of the slave trade. The Swahili and other slave dealers basically avoided them because they knew that they were so important to, in fact, the wealth-creating businesses that they had. You move further inland, you find pastoral communities, and these are living basically side by side with many of these communities that are rising on the coast. The idea is that when you look at the evolution of economic networks, people in the hinterland who might be living in rock shelters such as that, and people along in towns meet weekly at weekly markets. They exchange their products. And at the end of the day, everyone goes back to their home. Why are they not transforming? Why are hunter-gatherers not building nice houses such as those ones? Right? Because the most important thing is how you bring food to the table. Right? And I think that sometimes you tend to forget that by focusing so much on materiality that we actually forget the things that people are much more interested in. At the end of the day, you are much more interested in ensuring that you are bringing, you don't think about where your next meal is going to come from. So I think that my whole work, which, as Osman was saying, was recently recognized by the election, which came by surprise, election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, was precisely because we focused on the basics. What people do to make a living and how people are able to navigate and hold on to certain kinds of spheres of knowledge, because those are so much important than, in fact, sometimes the materiality that archaeology, in fact, points out. I want to explain what I've been doing lately by just looking at work that we are doing now, which, in fact, continues to explore these projects that we began some 30 years ago. And the work that we're doing is now focused on this island of Manda, which is, I think, the oldest port town on the Kenyan coast. It's very young. It's 600 AD. At least that's what we can identify. This is what it looks like today. The red parts show areas where we have excavated. Last summer, we were excavating this in this neighborhood here, the southern part. As you can see, the town is actually divided, surrounded by a wall, but it has there's a mini wall around them. So you have two sections of the town. Usually what comes to mind when looking at some of these medieval towns is one section for the indigenous, the locals, and the other section for diaspora communities. This is a question that we always ask. Because if you look each of these areas, this has its own mosque, has its own cemeteries. Over there, it has their own mosque, cemeteries. They are working together. They are distinct. They see each other every day. But suddenly there's a wall there that's keeping these communities, separating these communities. These are some of the standing ruins. We've done some geophysical survey. This just gives you a sense of some of the trenches that we have essentially been excavating. They're not as extensive. Nowadays, these NSF grants are very minimal, so you can't open up as much. And so they're directed the kinds of questions you are trying to ask. So in most cases, you don't ever have the chance to do as extensive excavations as you possibly can for the most part. And so one of the things that we've been interested in is not so much understanding what we already know, because ceramics is so well known, but we want to look at things that we don't often find that answer a lot of the questions that we want to ask. And this is basically looking at trying to find out evidence for reconstructing past ecosystems, the kinds of foods that people are eating. And so we've been doing a lot of flotation analysis. We do more or less 100% of the flotation analysis as we recover. What comes to mind that we find quite clearly is that you have very, very advanced, some of these urban areas that are emerging, very highly advanced local bead and cloth production. This is shown by most of these spindle walls. These are mostly local beads made out of marine as well as ostrich eggshell beads. But if you look over here, this is just from one trench, you'll see the glass beads that we find in each of the trench. So for glass beads, you might find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I think the majority is that you're looking at a local industry, cottage industry, that's actually quite advanced, right? Often what we do is that when you look at a lot of our publications, we emphasize this, emphasize the glass beads, we emphasize exotica, and we forget that we're really looking at communities that are very much secure. We're sort of fascinated by this sign here. I think that, but it doesn't mean what it is. It is just what it is, and we're not making any depiction of the. It looks like the Star of David, but it's basically a recycled piece from an Islamic ceramic piece shard. So in terms of just the local industries, Manda and many Swahili sites are basically dominated. 96% of most of the pottery will be locally made. So the 4% that we're looking at usually will be divided among different, obviously, Southwest Asian pottery dominates the market. Of course, Chinese ceramics appears at all levels. To give you a sense of the relationship between the local and the imported, this is what we're looking at here. Right? This is just at one trench. And so it gives you a sense of what is going on. If you look at the relation between thread beads, glass, and thread ceramics, that's sort of the level that we're talking about. And if you look at the distribution of some of the Chinese porcelain, it actually begins from Tang. This is from a previous publication that we did, but in the last season, we actually found shufu ware. So it is very clear that trade between East Africa and China is much older. It's actually at least continuously for the last 1,200 years. But the finding of shufu ware, I think, is really interesting. What we found, Song, Tang, Yuan, it comes all the way to the present. And one of the questions that I'm much more interested in is not only to find what's coming to East Africa, but essentially the nature of relationship that's going on within mainland China itself. I want to find out the sources of where these Chinese items are coming from. And the idea is eventually to be able to see these shifts in trade within mainland China itself, right? And I think be able to understand the major industrial complexes and how they're shifting through time. And as we begin carrying out some of the analysis, we are beginning to find that it's quite clear that many of these items through time are coming from different regions of China. And really helping us essentially understand the situation as it were, in China. Whenever we come upon, for example, coinage is important. But I think that we do know, and the coinage might get you an interview with New York Times. But I think that as an archaeologist, I'm much more interested in what is really going on. And some of these coins that are so-called imperial coins being brought to East Africa as gift items, or are they playing any other role in both diplomatic as well as economic? And I think in this case, finding out whether they are in fact authentic is much more important. And so we've been able to carry out, we found just these two coins. We know they are from the Yongle era, and we've been able to carry out some analysis. And what we are finding out is that compared to some of the results from Bauman, these are essentially from the British Museum context, assuming that these are essentially authentic, this is what we are finding out in terms of what they are. And so the question is, okay, there are some slight differences. And so could these be non-authentic ones or fake ones that are essentially coming in by way of Southeast Asia? Right. These are some of the questions that I think are important. The other thing that we are really looking at, beads are important. And the reason why beads are important in this trade is because anybody could buy them. From a hunter-gatherer, you find beads everywhere. Any rock shelter site in Africa, where you dig it, you'll find glass beads because they were affordable. They're also durable. And therefore, in terms of just looking at the distribution of these networks, beads are probably the best items to do. Ceramics are bulky, and therefore they tend to be confined in cities. But beads, boy, you get a lot of information. But in most cases, I think what we want to do, just like other artifacts, is where these beads are coming from and at what times. Right? So far, we've been able to find very few Chinese beads among us. Most of the beads are essentially dominated by South Asian beads from India, Sri Lanka, and then in the later period, after the Portuguese, you have a lot of Venetian, European beads. But I think in China, for the Chinese beads, there are far fewer. But what we've been able to find is that they seem to come in two different time periods, right? We've identified what we're calling the early type. And the early type are similar to the ones that John Mixick described from Fort Canning. And then we are also finding the late composition type that seem to be coming into East Africa right around this time. So you have an earlier version, and then you have a second version that's basically coming. This is post-Cheng Ha voyage to East Africa. Right? And so at Manda, for example, the majority of the beads that we are finding from Chinese seem to belong to an earlier period, the pre-1400, 14th century BC. And I think that this is essentially showing more or less the same. That most of the lead glass beads from Manda are from the early period. But we're finding beads are coming from possibly as far as Central Asia. Of course, we have the Middle Eastern type. One of the questions that we have sort of shied away from, underlying this elephant in the room as far as East Africa and the African past is concerned. There was always a tendency to sort of see what will be associated with progress, both in terms of cities, as something that was somewhat non-African. And I think that in East Africa, the elephant in the room has always been that the Swahili civilization, so-called Swahili civilization, is basically an Arab civilization, no, but not an African one. And I think that before we started working, nobody really, there was those claims that nobody really tried to find out who these people were. So we said, well, if they are, we don't care, they're just African people anyway. Everybody's African. So let's just dig them up and see who they are. And in fact, what we've been able to, our work is the only one that has systematically excavated cemeteries. This is a Muslim context. So to just be allowed to excavate a cemetery is not easy. It took us about 25 years to convince the elders that this was, in fact, very important. And so you can look here, we have, for example, from this site, 109. More recently, from Manda, we have 19 individuals that we have basically surveyed. What we're finding out is that the majority of these people generally are African, for the most part. We are also looking at many respects. We're looking at the patterns of health and demography based on this large collection that we have. We are looking at their life histories, how they lived, what they died from, any infectious diseases that they may have had. Find, like in any urban region, we're finding evidence of perhaps syphilis among some of these communities, interaction with being people along the coast. So you're finding a lot of information that is very useful. But we are also finding that intermarriage to a very small extent is going on. And I think that this individual here, fits the mode of what you might call, he does have Middle Eastern facial features, but he has an African Ukrainian feature too. So basically this is a person who is a bicultural individual at this particular time that we're talking about, around the 15th century. There's another, so intermarriage is going on, but to a very small extent. There's also another individual that we excavated at Manda. And this individual here, was about 26-year-old young man, and he was actually buried out here, just outside the wall. The dates we have are about 60 years after the voyage of Admiral Cheng Ha. When Janet Monge, who's a colleague of mine at Penn, examined this individual, she found that he has shovel incisor teeth. And this is basically typical of East Asians, right? And so it is quite possible, because of the context of this individual, which is outside, that he was a member of, the tomb is actually quite, this is the tomb. So he was buried quite respectively, but he was buried outside, away from the main cemetery, right? And so it turns out to be an Asian guy, died at 25 years old. Some of the preliminary results that we are getting from the ancient DNA from at least some of the individuals from Manda is very interesting. And this is just the results of the first 10 individuals, including that Asian one. So out of the 10, we found that 4 were distinctly African, 3 were Near Eastern, and 3 are actually East Asian. This is just preliminary results that we are finding there, which is very curious. It's very good. We're not saying anything, but it's just very curious results. I think one of the other things that we've been able to do is now to essentially try to figure out some of the biological genealogies of the peoples of the Swahili coast. And we actually were able to do this. We collected saliva samples from 1,000 people in different villages and towns along the Kenyan coast. And some of the preliminary results that we are getting are very interesting. So if you look at this area here, you can actually see that there is a Southeast and Southeast Asian component, genetic component to this. And this might just be related to the Austronesians who are basically now living in Madagascar. This might actually be the case. But it might also mean something really different. But as you can see, the peoples of East Africa, the East African coast, are very much representative of any urban community that you'll find in the north. For example, when you talk about East Africa, we don't talk about the fact that the Portuguese were there for 200 years before the Omanis came. I think today what the Omanis are doing is trying to rewrite history so that they basically write off the 200 years the Portuguese were in East Africa. The genetics don't lie. It's basically beginning to show that these interactions have always been there. Deep down, I think that even as we begin thinking about these areas, we have to begin thinking about ways in which our ancestors, people who lived before us, people who are separated by thousands of miles, people who were always at the mercy of people, of their hosts. And you just can't travel from Persia, from China, and come to East Africa and start running around with people's wives. You don't. You build networks. And I think that answering those very clear, those simple questions of how people develop relationships, how these relationships turn into trust, enter into building contacts. And you succeed because you have people who trust you, because of the goodwill of friends. Those personal ties were very important. Today we might disregard them. But I think that when looking at this region here, trade in the Indian Ocean and everywhere was really based on some of these key 5 years. One's reputation was very important. The way you carried yourself in the community made you who you are. It brought people towards you. Right? You just couldn't go around running out. So I think there are many scholars who think that Africans or wherever communities so in the last 500 years who have become in many ways disadvantaged or just run over. I think we need to rethink some of the models. And our work is very clearly showing that the more we begin thinking about these kinds of interactions, the more we realize that we have hardly scratched the surface. But in many ways, what we've been dealing with is our own perspectives about the past. But I think that the past that we knew, that as it were, we have hardly yet begun to look at, to explore it. One of the great advantages we have is technology. The other advantage we have today is that for the first time in our history, we are able to, we have so many voices in the writing of the past, that those voices are not dominated by particular men like me and Steve who have worked in these areas, but they are dominated by, in fact, majority of our students are women. And this is very exciting because they're bringing a perspective that we ever did not imagine, right? I think that the exciting part is that archaeologists are now beginning to actually do anthropology, right? We are going there and talking to the people and reconstructing a lot of these models on our own right, rather than have to depend on our cultural anthropology colleagues who have somewhat moved somewhere else and they have their heads in the cloud looking at things that archaeology perhaps might not be as interested in. And so as I look at this, I see the future as something that's really, really, really bright. And I think that forums such as this are only going to get us to ask the right questions at the right time, because everything is happening at completely the right time. We have technology, we have everything that we need. Thank you very much.